Before you settle in tonight, kettle on, blanket pulled up, I want you to imagine something. Imagine your whole family, in a cold little office, deciding what you're worth. Not out loud. Just in how they divide up a dead woman's life. The house. The money. The jewelry. And then, almost a joke between them, the one thing left over. The one thing nobody wanted. That's what they gave Margaret Winslow. A damp, half-collapsed house, and not one kind word with it. They should have looked more carefully. Something in that house had waited 30 years for someone to knock on the right wall. If you love a quiet story done properly, tap that heart and subscribe before we begin. The solicitor's office in Ashcombe smelled of dust and cold tea, and Margaret Winslow had been sitting very still in it for the better part of an hour. She sat at the end of the row, as she always did. Her cousin Edwin Price sat nearest the desk, his coat still buttoned though the room was warm enough, one knee bouncing very slightly, a habit Margaret remembered from childhood, the tell he'd never managed to lose whenever money was about to be discussed. Beside him, Clarissa arranged her gloves in her lap with the patience of a woman who had never once doubted she'd be provided for, though she checked the clock on the wall twice in the space of a minute, as if provision might still, somehow, arrive late. Great-Aunt Hester had been dead 3 weeks. Margaret still expected, some mornings, to hear the old woman's step on the stair. Mr. Aldridge, the solicitor, cleared his throat and began to read. The London townhouse, with its rents and its good address, went to Edwin. He accepted this with a small, quick exhale, relief, Margaret thought, rather than triumph, though she couldn't have said why she thought so. The jewelry, the sapphire brooch, the pearl combs, the small chest of investments, went to Clarissa, who sat up a fraction straighter, as if the inheritance were less a gift than a verdict she'd been waiting to have confirmed. Then Mr. Aldridge turned a page, and read the third clause more quietly, as though it embarrassed him to say it aloud. To my great-niece Margaret, he read, I leave Fenmore House, and all its contents, in the hope that she will find there what others could not. Silence. Then Clarissa's soft, surprised laugh, the kind that pretends not to be unkind. Fenmore, she said. Good heavens! That old wreck. Edwin didn't laugh, but he didn't disagree either. Half the roof's gone, I'd think. Hester hadn't set foot in it in years. It'll cost more to keep than it's worth. He said it the way a man says something he needs to be true, and Margaret, who had spent 6 years learning to read the particular strain beneath Edwin's confidence, wondered, not for the first time, whether his townhouse came with rather more debt attached to it than anyone in the family discussed at dinner. She always did have a strange sense of humor, Clarissa said, tucking her gloves into her bag, not quite meeting Margaret's eye. Leaving Meg the one thing nobody else would take. Margaret said nothing. She had long ago learned that silence cost her less than defending herself, and defending herself had never once changed how they saw her. She thought of Fenmore only distantly, a house she'd visited twice as a girl, all dark wood and cold stone, and a library that had smelled of beeswax and rain. She hadn't thought of it in 20 years, and yet, sitting there, she found she could still hear the particular groan the third stair used to make. Well, Edwin said, standing and buttoning his coat tighter still, as if the matter were now closed, someone has to take the ruins. I don't mind, Margaret said. It was the first thing she'd said all morning, and it came out steadier than she expected. Clarissa looked at her properly then, really looked, the way she rarely bothered to. There was something like pity in it, though she'd have called it kindness. You always were good at making do, Meg. It was not meant as a compliment. Margaret took it as one anyway. Outside, the rain had started, the fine, patient rain of a Somerset afternoon. Edwin hailed a cab without looking back, already talking, low and urgent, to Clarissa about something Margaret didn't catch, a bank, a due date, a name she almost recognized. Clarissa paused at the door only long enough to say, "Do let us know if it falls down entirely," before she, too, was gone. Margaret stood a moment longer, holding a set of keys she hadn't expected to hold. She did not yet know what Aunt Hester had truly left her. But something in the old woman's phrasing stayed with her the whole drive home, in the hope that she will find there what others could not, tucked in the back of her mind like a door left very slightly ajar. What she also didn't know, what she wouldn't learn for weeks yet, was that Edwin's whispered urgency outside that office had rather more to do with Fenmore than either cousin would ever willingly admit. To understand why Margaret accepted Fenmore without complaint, you would have to understand the shape her life had taken over the last 15 years, quietly, without anyone deciding it on her behalf, and yet somehow decided all the same. She had married young, and been widowed young. Her husband, a quiet ship's clerk named Thomas, lost to a fever before they'd had 5 years together. There had been no children. There had been, for a long while, very little of anything, a small flat in Bristol, a position as companion to elderly women who needed someone steady more than someone brilliant, and a family who had, without ever quite saying so, filed her under the one who didn't do as well. When Great Aunt Hester's health began to fail, it was Margaret who went to her, not because she was asked more than the others, but because she was the only one who said yes. Edwin had his position in London, and, Margaret suspected now, turning it over, his creditors, quiet and patient as creditors are until suddenly they aren't. Clarissa had her engagements, and a husband's family who never quite let her forget she'd married beneath their notion of good blood, a wound Clarissa nursed by making very certain everyone else knew their place instead. Margaret had time, because Margaret's life had never been considered important enough to interrupt. For 6 years, she went to Hester twice a month, then twice a week, then finally moved into a small room down the hall from the old woman's own, reading to her in the evenings, keeping the accounts, learning which drafts came through which doors. Hester had never thanked her extravagantly. She was not an extravagant woman. But she watched Margaret in a way the others never had, a long, considering look, as if adding something up and finding the sum better than expected. "You don't complain," Hester said to her once, near the end. "Your cousins would have complained from the first week." There wasn't much to complain about. There was everything to complain about, Hester replied, and you didn't. That's not nothing, Margaret. Don't let anyone tell you that's nothing. Margaret hadn't understood, then, that she was being told something important. Her family, meanwhile, had built a version of her that suited them, capable, unambitious, a little dull, useful in the way a good coat is useful, serviceable, unremarkable, easily forgotten in a hallway. When Hester's care fell to her, it was spoken of as simply what Meg does, never a sacrifice worth naming. When Fenmore came to her, it was received the same way, not an inheritance, but one more unremarkable thing settling onto the unremarkable cousin. There is a particular peace, she'd found, in lowering your expectations early enough. You are rarely disappointed, because you have already forgiven the disappointment in advance. So when Edwin called Fenmore a wreck, and Clarissa called it a joke, Margaret did not feel wounded so much as confirmed. What she did not yet understand, what she could not have understood, sitting in that solicitor's office with a set of old keys in her glove, was that being underestimated by people who never looked closely was not the same as being unseen by everyone. Hester had looked closely. Hester had spent 6 years watching what Margaret did with quiet dignity, an accounting book kept in tidy columns, a garden tended without being asked, a difficult old woman managed without complaint even on the worst nights. Hester had drawn her own conclusions and said nothing of them to anyone, not even, quite, to Margaret herself. She had simply gone, in the last years of her life, and made her arrangements, with a solicitor she trusted, a housekeeper she trusted more, and a silence she kept so completely that not even Mr. Aldrich, reading the will aloud, seemed entirely at ease with how little of it he was permitted to say. Margaret would learn, before the month was out, exactly how carefully that silence had been kept, and by how many people. Fenmore House stood a mile beyond the last cottage of Ashcombe, at the end of a lane so overgrown that the cab driver stopped a quarter-mile short and refused, politely but firmly, to take the springs of his cart any closer. Margaret walked the rest of the way in a light rain, one bag in each hand, and saw the house rise out of the hedgerows the way a half-remembered face rises out of a dream. It was smaller than she remembered, and larger than the cousin Scorn had suggested. Grey stone, ivy climbing one whole wing as if trying to pull it back into the earth. Half the shutters hung at angles. But the roof, Edwin's confident prediction notwithstanding, was largely sound, and the chimneys stood straight. She was still some way off when a voice called out from the hedge line. "You'll be Miss Winslow, then." A woman emerged from what Margaret realized was a kitchen garden gone half to bramble, wiping her hands on an apron that had clearly seen 40 years of service. She was perhaps 70, broad and unhurried, with the particular directness of someone who has long since stopped bothering with airs. "Prudence Dench," the woman said, by way of introduction. "Prue, if you like. I kept house here for your aunt going on 30 years, and I've been keeping half an eye on the place since, though nobody's paid me to, and I'll thank you not to mention that to the solicitor." Margaret, startled into something like a laugh for the first time in weeks, said she wouldn't dream of it. "She spoke of you," Prue said, studying Margaret with the same considering look Margaret remembered from Hester herself. She wondered, absurdly, whether the two women had learned it from each other, or simply from 30 years of watching the same family from close range. "More than she spoke of the others, if you want the truth of it." "Come on, then. Kettle's already on. I put it on when I saw you coming up the lane. You can see the gate from the back window, if you know to look." It was, Margaret would reflect later, the first properly kind thing anyone had said to her in weeks that didn't come wrapped in an old woman's dying letter. Inside, the air was cool and still and smelled exactly as she remembered, beeswax gone old and faint, damp stone, the mustiness of a house shut up with its books rather than aired. Dust lay over everything, though rather less than she'd expected, given Edwin's confident talk of ruin. "I've kept the 2 front rooms swept," Prue said, catching her look. "And the library. Your aunt would have my head otherwise, God rest her, wherever she's watching from." "The library especially?" Margaret asked, more out of politeness than curiosity. Something crossed Prue's face, brief, considering, dawn before Margaret could properly name it. She was particular about that room, was all Prue said. Always was. "You'll see." They had tea in the kitchen, and Prue talked, about the coal delivery, about a boy in the village called Tam Ferris who did odd garden work for a fair wage and less fair manners, about the ironmonger who'd cheat her blind given half a chance. It was, Margaret thought, the most ordinary conversation she'd had in a month, and she was grateful for every unremarkable word of it. That night she slept in the small room she remembered from girlhood, the bed a little musty but sound, a hot water bottle from her bag pressed against the chill. Rain moved steadily against the windows, a sound she found, to her surprise, comforting rather than lonely. She woke twice in the night to what she took, both times, for the settling of old timber. It was only on the second waking, lying still and listening properly, that she noticed the sound seemed to come, both times, from the same direction. From the library, 1 floor below. She told herself it was nothing. Old houses talk to themselves at night. But in the morning, over breakfast, she mentioned it to Prue, lightly, expecting to be told exactly that. Prue went very still over the teapot. "Did you now?" she said, in a voice that had lost its easy warmth entirely. "And which nights were those?" Margaret told her. Prue set the teapot down with unusual care, as though it had suddenly become something that might break. "Your aunt used to say the same thing," she said slowly. "Right up until the end. I always told her it was nothing." She paused. "I'm no longer entirely sure I believed myself, even then." She said nothing further on the matter, and changed the subject to the coal delivery with a briskness that told Margaret, more clearly than any answer could have, that the subject was not remotely closed. The first week at Fenmore passed in a particular rhythm of small repairs, the kind of work Margaret had always found more restful than idle. Tam Ferris turned out to be a wiry boy of perhaps 15, freckled and unimpressed by most things in the world except, oddly, the state of the garden wall, which he inspected on his first morning with the gravity of a physician examining a difficult patient. "Your aunt let the espaliers go to ruin," he informed Margaret, with the frank disapproval only a 15-year-old can manage toward an adult he's never met. "Pears trained flat against a south wall like that, and nobody pruned them in years. Criminal, that is." "I'll leave the criminality in your capable hands, then," Margaret said, and was rewarded with the closest thing to a smile Tam seemed willing to offer a stranger. He was, she came to find over the following days, sharper than his manner suggested, the sort of boy who noticed things and said so, without much concern for whether the noticing was wanted. It was Tam, in fact, clearing ivy from the library's outer wall on the third day, who called up to her through the window with the particular bluntness of the very young. "There's a draft coming from somewhere in there that oughtn't be," he said. "I can feel it right through the stone from out here. Something's not sealed proper behind that wall." Margaret, who had noticed the same draft from the inside without yet placing its source, went very still. She'd taken, in the evenings, to sitting in the library with a shawl over her knees, working through the shelves a section at a time. Most of what she found was unremarkable: sermons, atlases, a full run of a gardening periodical Hester had subscribed to for 30 years without missing an issue. Tam's espalier complaint, she noted wryly, was apparently a long-standing family failing. But she noticed, too, that one section of shelving along the north wall sat very slightly proud of the wall behind it, and that the draft Tam had felt through the stone stirred the lamp flame most strongly whenever she sat close to it. On the third evening, examining the skirting more closely, she found a small, locked drawer built into the base of a nearby writing desk, stiff, dusty, clearly unopened in years. Her pulse quickened. This, surely, was what the house had been waiting to show her. It took her the better part of an hour, and a hairpin, and considerably more patience than she'd have admitted to Prue, before the lock finally gave. Inside, old correspondence, entirely unremarkable, receipts for coal, a decade-old letter from a cousin twice removed, nothing more. She sat back, oddly deflated, feeling rather foolish for the quick impulse of an hour before. It was only afterward, replacing a heavy volume of parish records against the north wall, that her hand brushed something behind the row of identical brown bindings, flat against the stone, where no browsing hand would find it by accident. A small, tarnished brass key. She held it a long moment in the lamplight, the false excitement of the drawer still fresh enough to make her cautious. She did not go looking for a lock that evening. She banked the fire instead, turned the key over once in her palm, and let the thought settle the way she let most things settle, slowly, without forcing it. But she found herself, over the following days, paying the library a different kind of attention. She noted, low in the paneling beneath that same proud shelf, a small brass keyhole she had taken, at a glance, for decorative ironwork, the sort of thing you might dust past 100 times without truly seeing. She did not mention any of it to Prue, who she suspected already knew rather more than she was saying, and had a strong feeling, not quite fear, not quite excitement, something steadier than either, that whatever waited behind that wall, it had been waiting rather longer for her than 1 week. The key turned with a small, precise click, the sound of a mechanism well made and oiled far more recently than the rest of the house would suggest. For a moment nothing happened. Then, with a soft groan of old hinges, a section of the paneling, nearly 4 feet wide, the width of the shelving above it, swung inward, revealing not a cupboard, as Margaret had half expected, but a narrow doorway, and beyond it, darkness, and the same cold draught she and Tam had both been chasing all week. She sat back on her heels, heart going harder than she'd have liked to admit, and fetched the lamp instead of a candle before she went in. The passage was short, perhaps 8 feet, and led to a small room, no larger than a pantry, built into dead space between the library and the old servants' stair. The walls were dry, which surprised her. Someone had taken care, at some point, to seal this space properly against the damp that plagued the rest of the house. The room held a writing desk, a single chair, and a tall, narrow cabinet with glass-fronted doors. On the desk sat a stack of ledgers, tied with ribbon gone soft with handling, and beside them, an envelope with her own name written across it in Hester's careful, upright hand. Margaret set the lamp down very carefully, as if sudden movement might undo what she was seeing, and opened the letter first. My dear Margaret, if you are reading this, you have done exactly what I hoped you would do, which is nothing more complicated than pay proper attention to a house that asked for it. I always did think that was the whole of your character, worn plainly where anyone might have seen it, if they'd cared to look. Your cousins will have called Fenmore a ruin. Let them. A house that keeps its best rooms secret from careless eyes is not a ruin, it is simply discerning, same as I was, in the end, about which of my family deserved to be told the truth of things. What is in this room is not a fortune in the way Edwin would count one, though it is not nothing either. It is 30 years of careful keeping, investments made quietly, rents collected and reinvested, a small but sound portfolio managed by Mr. Aldridge under instruction that none of the family were to know of it until the will was read. There is also, in the cabinet, what remains of my mother's jewelry, the pieces I never let Clarissa see, because I knew precisely what she would do with them, and it was not what I wanted done. Prue knows about this room, and has kept it secret at my asking for longer than I had any right to ask of her. I trust you'll see she's properly looked after, she has earned a great deal more than her wages ever paid her. I have left you the house because I trusted you to look after it properly, whether or not anything came with it. I have left you what's behind this wall because you are the only one of them who would have found it by paying attention rather than by being told where to look. That, to me, was always the measure of a person worth trusting. Be well, my dear. Light the fires. Keep the garden. And don't, for one moment, let anyone make you feel that what you were given was worth less than what they took. Your loving Aunt, Hester. Margaret sat a long while in the small dry room, the letter in her lap, the lamp throwing its steady light across the ledgers and the cabinet and the narrow blade of grey window above. She did not cry, though she came close. Mostly what she felt was something quieter than grief and larger than surprise. It was well past midnight when she finally climbed the stairs again, the letter folded carefully in her pocket. She meant to sleep. Instead she lay awake a long while, turning over one particular line Hester had written, the truth of things, and wondering, with a small, cold clarity she hadn't expected, exactly what Edwin's whispered urgency outside the solicitor's office had really been about. She had a strong feeling she was about to find out. Margaret told no one right away, which was, itself, entirely in character. She did tell Prue, who received the news with a long exhale and a frank admission that she'd been dreading and hoping for this exact conversation for 30 years, in roughly equal measure, and had a good cry into her apron that she pretended, afterward, hadn't happened at all. She spent the following weeks quietly setting things in order, writing to Mr. Aldrich, who received her letter with what she suspected was a carefully suppressed satisfaction, and confirmed everything Hester's letter had promised. The investments were real, and sound, and had grown steadily over 3 decades. The jewelry, appraised discreetly by a dealer in Bristol, was worth a good deal more than either cousin's inheritance combined. It was Clarissa who found out first, in the way Clarissa found out most things, through a mutual acquaintance, at a dinner, delivered as gossip before anyone quite realized what they were repeating. Old Hester's solicitor tells me the Fenmore estate turned out rather better than anyone expected, the acquaintance said, over the soup. Some hidden investments, apparently. Terribly clever of her, tucking it all away like that. Clarissa set down her spoon rather more firmly than the moment required. She wrote to Margaret within the week, warmer than any letter she'd sent in years, full of "We simply must visit and I do hope Fenmore is treating you well," and Margaret read it twice, and answered it kindly, and did not mention the room behind the library wall. Edwin's reaction, when it came, was blunter, and rather more revealing. He arrived at Fenmore unannounced on a grey Tuesday, ostensibly to see how she was getting on. He stood in the newly restored drawing-room with an expression Margaret recognized from childhood, a man recalculating, quickly, how much attention a person deserved, and it was Prue, bringing in the tea-tray, who let slip, with what Margaret suspected was entirely deliberate carelessness, that a certain London bank had written to Fenmore twice that month asking after Mr. Price's address. Edwin's composure slipped for exactly 1 second before he recovered it. "A misdirected letter," he said. "Nothing more." Margaret, who had learned a great deal about reading Edwin's tells over 30 years of family dinners, said only, "Of course," and poured his tea, and let the matter sit exactly where he'd left it, which was, she'd come to realize, rather more unsettling to him than any direct question could have been. He didn't ask outright what everyone was now quietly wondering, where the money had come from, why the wreck he'd so confidently written off was suddenly worth a visit and, apparently, a debt collector's letterhead. Pride kept the question in his throat. But he looked at her differently before he left, the way people look at something they've recently learned to price correctly, and Margaret suspected, though she never asked, and Prue never confirmed it outright, that the letter from the bank was not, in fact, the first such letter Fenmore's new address had quietly redirected. She found she didn't much mind either way. She had spent enough of her life needing her family's good opinion, she found, now, she could do without it, and the house around her, warm, dry, quietly hers, was regard enough. What she minded, if anything, was smaller and stranger than triumph, a faint, private wish that Hester could have seen the roof mended, the garden coming back green, the library fire lit every evening instead of only in memory. She thought, more than once, that Hester probably had seen it, in her way, had known, all those years managing quiet ledgers in a hidden room, exactly how this would end. What she did not yet know was that Hester had left one more instruction with Mr. Aldrich, a small one, easily missed among the larger clauses of the will, that would not come due for another 12 months yet. By the following spring, Fenmore House no longer looked like anyone's idea of a ruin. The ivy had been cut back from the east windows and allowed to grow, tended now, along the garden wall instead, where Tam insisted it belonged. The roof held against the rain. Smoke rose steadily from the chimneys on cold mornings, and the garden had begun to give back what years of neglect had taken, early bulbs along the drive, the beginnings of a proper kitchen garden where the old one had gone to bramble, and, along the south wall, 2 pear trees pruned with what Tam considered, at last, a decent regard for their dignity. Prue stayed on, properly paid, this time, and rather pleased about it, though she'd never have said so plainly. Margaret kept the library much as she'd found it, dust and all, except for the section of shelving along the north wall, which she'd had rehung so the hidden door swung easily now, no longer stiff with age. She didn't hide what was behind it, exactly. But she didn't advertise it either. That spring, Mr. Aldrich wrote to remind her of the final clause in Hester's will, the small one, easily missed, that a portion of the estate be set aside, 1 year after Margaret took possession, for the village school, which had gone without proper heating for 2 winters running. Margaret read the instruction with a smile, and wrote back the same week to say it would be done, and that she rather thought Hester had simply wanted to be sure Margaret would still be there, a year on, settled enough to carry it out herself. In the evenings, when the fire was lit and the rain came soft against the windows, Margaret sat in the library with her tea and let herself simply be still, no longer waiting to be noticed, no longer measuring her worth against what her cousins thought she deserved. She thought sometimes of the moment in the solicitor's office, Clarissa's soft laugh, Edwin's careless dismissal. She no longer felt the sting of it. They had given her, without meaning to, exactly what she needed, a house quiet enough to listen to, a housekeeper loyal enough to keep its secrets, a garden boy sharp enough to notice its drafts, and time enough to learn what all of it was trying to tell her. The fire settled. The rain went on, patient against old stone. And Fenmore House, warm now, and known, and entirely hers, kept whatever secrets remained the way all good houses do, gently, and only for those who stay long enough to earn them. Thank you for spending this evening at Fenmore with Margaret, and with Prue, and with me. If you found some comfort here, in the rain against the windows, in a house that finally got its due, in a woman who was underestimated for years and never once let it harden her, tap that heart below, and if you're new here, consider subscribing. We tell these stories every week, slow and quiet, for anyone who needs somewhere gentle to land at the end of a long day. Tell us in the comments where you're listening from tonight, and whether it's raining where you are. We read every one of them by our own fire, and there's something rather lovely about knowing how many quiet corners of the world this reaches. And before you go, I'll leave you with the same question Hester might have asked, if she'd had the chance. What has been handed to you that others called worthless, that you haven't yet looked closely enough to find? Sleep well. We'll see you next time.